Yeah, so thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to moderate this panel on how businesses and social enterprises can accelerate social change. This question is not a new question. This question is one that many of us have been exploring for a while. There is no dearth of service or product innovation. It's really about how we transform the models with which we work with to bring innovation to life in a sustainable way. It's quite clear that at the rate that we're going, we will not be able to meet our goals around climate change, around equality. And that's why I'm very excited to have a great set of five panelists here to really unpackage what more we can do in a tangible and concrete way to drive forward social change. So, by way of introduction, Samira Khan, I have been working in the tech for impact space for about 5 years now at Salesforce and Microsoft. Prior to that, I worked with social sector organizations as well as for-profit businesses. And I encourage each of you to introduce yourself in the chat. Part of this is also a forum for us to meet one another, hopefully keep in touch and exchange ideas later. So with that, I would also like to introduce the five amazing panelists that I mentioned. We have Elsa Skogström-Felt, who is the Managing Director of IKEA Social Entrepreneurship BV. We have Sumitra Pasupati, who is the Global Stewardship Lead with Ashoka. I also have Alexandra van der Vloek, who is the Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at SAP. Yasmina Zaidman, who is the Chief Partnerships and Development Officer at Acumen. And we have Natalia Vega Berry, who's the founder of the Global Brain, and formerly she was with the UN Global Compact. So to kick this off, I know we all intuitively know why social entrepreneurs and businesses should be doing more together to drive social change. However, I'd really love to hear, in your own words, the speakers from the vantage point from which you sit, given your work, why you think this is important and why you think it's important now at this time. I would also love for you to use that as a way to elaborate on your work a little more. And I wanted to start with Yasmina just because of the number of social entrepreneurs you see and meet each day through Acumen, and followed by Sumitra, and then we'll get to Natalia and the corporate perspective as well. So Yasmina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Samira. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. Thank you all for joining. This is a topic that I think all of us care a lot about. So yeah, I'm Yasmina Zaidman. I am the Chief Development and Partnerships Officer at Acumen, where I have been a member of the team for almost 20 years. So I've had a chance to really see a lot of evolution in the kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem, where we've focused a lot on for-profit models that can tackle issues that impact the lives of the poor. And I think that, what we've observed over the years is that for companies to really scale their impact on the lives of the poor, they really need to partner creatively. And we've seen those partnerships happen with governments in terms of scaling innovations in areas like safe drinking water, sanitation, healthcare, but also often with the private sector. So, for example, aggregating smallholder farmers to improve their incomes, but then partnering with large corporations to do offtake and really bring those products to market. So over the last couple of years, we've looked really closely at this space. And what we've learned is that it's not only really valuable for social enterprises in order to scale, which was kind of where we started, but for corporations themselves, who now face tremendous challenges and opportunities to shift their business models towards models that are much more inclusive, that really have a positive impact for vulnerable people and overlooked markets, and that are also sustainable, that take into account planetary constraints. And so they're looking at social enterprises as a real source of innovation and on-the-ground impact, and shifting from a lens of looking at that purely through a CSR lens and much more through a core business lens. So we see a lot of potential for partnerships. We did a report last year we can put into the chat that really looks at what kinds of social enterprises are corporate ready. Who is making it work? We know there's a lot of challenges and barriers, and we've all dealt with them, but we're actually seeing success stories, and often with some of the companies that are joining us on the panel. So this is a great group to dig in to how do you make it work? because it can work, and we think it can actually really accelerate how we transition mainstream business towards something that is more inclusive and sustainable.
Thank you so much, Yasmina. And so, in terms of just the value you think business are deriving from social enterprises or their partnerships with social entrepreneurs, do you think that value is being realized? Because I know coming from the corporate sector, one question that keeps emerging is what is the value? How do we measure it? How do we justify it? And would love sort of your 2 cents on that before we switch over to Sumitra.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that value is being captured. In the research that we did, we found that 75% of the companies that we looked at were tracking against SDG goals. But when we looked at how many of their corporate clients were really keyed into that and asking for metrics related to social impact and inclusion, very few were. In fact, I think a lot of corporations are now starting to talk about supplier diversity, and they're not really looking past ownership. So the idea is that if you look past ownership at who is employed, who's in the supply chain, how employees are treated, and what kinds of benefits are accruing to local communities when you work with sustainable social enterprises, that there's a lot of value being left on the table. So I think it's really on corporations to start thinking about how they measure impact across all the pieces of their business, and also incentivize higher social performance. Because the challenge for a lot of these companies is they can deliver that value, but they need their corporate partners to also recognize that as smaller, earlier stage companies, they may need some flexibility with payment terms or some support in getting engaged in that supply chain. So it's really a two-way street in terms of value creation, but a lot, I think, is being left on the table.
Super helpful, Yasmina. And so Sumitra, from your perspective, why is this an important question? What more can businesses and social entrepreneurs be doing together?
Sure, Samira, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's good to see some friends in the audience on the call. I'm calling from Singapore. I'm Malaysian by origin, but excitingly, I think I'm in the backwaters of close to 2 billion people and in the bottom of the pyramid, largely. In Ashoka, we talk about finding individuals that have developed and taken creative action to solve some of the largest problems. And when I think about where we are in the world today, I think we're seeing a very different world emerge. The world is moving incredibly fast. We're seeing multi-level issues, multi-level fragilities, complexities. I mean, COVID was a great example. We're in the middle of a geopolitical war, which we didn't expect. We're having supply chain disasters around the world. So in this sort of, and I think the last 2 years are just giving us a snapshot of what more to expect. And in this world of rapid change and complexity, folks and populations that are residing the bottom of the pyramid experience them. It's much more intense for those in the bottom of the pyramid. So in Ashoka, we're always wondering, with 4,000 social entrepreneurs globally, very centered on innovation, we're always asking the question, how do we design for a future that's more inclusive now, right? And how do we bring that innovation and that innovation mindset across the board from the private sector, the public sector, and take it out of just the social entrepreneurship sector. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and synergy to bring innovation into the corporate sector. I mean, I started my career close to 25 years ago in a big MNC in Brussels and doing innovation work. And, back then it was, it took us 10, 15 years to come up with one prototype, right? And Samira, you're familiar with the tech world. We are putting out, innovations that rapidly advancing right now. And there are lots of new ideas that are going out very fast. So we can't afford to take one step at a time, company looking inward only, or social entrepreneurs looking inward only in terms of tackling problems. We need to reach across the aisle and try to build this collaborative ecosystem that generates more breakthrough solutions in half the time. So I think that's where I'm excited to think about how do we how do we bring social entrepreneurs, how do we bring social innovators into the conversation within companies, and what more do we need to do to make that happen?
Thank you so much, Sumitra. And I think that's a perfect segue into some of your work, Natalia, which is really holistic. And I would love for you to describe sort of the ethos behind your work and the focus around really sustainability and purpose everywhere and in everything.
Thank you, Samira. Delighted to be here with everybody. So, sure, absolutely. So my role in the Global Brain Foundation is we are a creative incubator. So what we do is we have, projects that need to tackle into, more of innovation and creativity. I think I'm coming from a different perspective on all of this. When I see and when I hear Samira especially speaking about this, I see it in a way how social enterprise can elevate citizenship with corporations and can lead that conversation and influence corporate world. So that is a kind of totally different angle to see, but I believe the social enterprises are a force. I think it is important to also realize that the narratives that play around this now in the world are really crucial and important, even either for both sides, especially for the corporate side. We believe that the narrative on these big issues, for example, on climate change, need to be changed to the everything change, because we are facing this everything change, especially for social enterprise, for the organizations that really are moving faster into applying changes and actually becoming actually social and environmentally entrepreneurs. I think every enterprise now is an impact, has an impact and sustainability at its core, and how that is influencing the way for corporations to follow. There are many examples in which that translating, in which the people have now influencing big the role of corporations. But I think the role that we are playing in the space is very much needed in terms of the narrative. And I would just want to amplify that. Working with the United Nations Global Compact for past 2 years was a really very enlightening to understand. And for an organization that big, to understand that SMEs are a key drive force for innovation and for citizenship. It's something that pretty much stands out currently.
Thank you so much for bringing that perspective to it. And also, I would love to hear from you, just building off some of the comments earlier on looking outside, well, looking not just inward, but looking outside and bringing innovations in. This idea of narrative that Natalia mentioned. What has worked for you in sort of your role, and what are you seeing sort of as being the ways in which companies are thinking more innovatively in terms of how they can partner with social entrepreneurs?
Yes, one of the things that came out of a study and a roundtable we did in terms of narrative, in terms of narratives and social enterprise, especially in the corporate side, this is something that all of a sudden lies into the greenwashing aspect of it that corporations face. Social enterprises and the work corporations are doing with them is a fantastic way for them to see their corporate social sustainability, stand. And in many, it's a very, very good, I will say, segue in terms of narrative, how corporations are really mobilizing and catalyzing action with such an important group of as entrepreneurship and social enterprise. That brings a lot of new ways of making narrative stand. And I think the stories itself that you see are great examples. So I will encourage more corporations to take that path in terms of the stories they tell and use it as a force for communication and as a force for, I will say, being more out there and sharing more about what they're doing internally. I have been working very closely with CMOs for the most important, corporations lately. And the problem they have is that they usually cannot say much because it backlashes in terms of their stand on corporate social responsibility and what they need to say and what, they rather not say anything. But that causes a problem because you don't see momentum. And we see the fantastic work organizations, in this case like IKEA or others, are doing in this space, especially with the social enterprise, but yeah, that has been a problem. But I think this could be a fantastic way to tell stories and turn into this human component, about how social enterprise evolve and just happen. There are fantastic stories to tell in the space. So I think that could be more utilized in the space of corporate communications as well, and so corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. We're very much aligned sort of in bringing out this human element. So, I'm excited to unpackage that a bit more later. But over to you, Ausa. Just IKEA was just mentioned. I know you're doing some excellent work sort of at the intersection of social entrepreneurs and business. So Ausa would really love to hear a little bit more about your work.
Yes, I apologize in advance because my internet is for some reason very unstable today. So let me know if you cannot hear me. So for the shout out,
Yeah, it's
social entrepreneurship. We are working with social entrepreneurs.
Yeah, Ausa, it's a little patchy. I actually can't hear you.
Okay, let me log out and log back in, and then I'll see you in 2 minutes.
Excellent. Alexandra, do you want to take the question around how sort of corporations and social enterprises can do more together, especially around innovation, as well as just share a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, thank you, Samira. I think I would love to highlight particularly two ways in how we partner with social enterprises and the sector in general. But would also love to use that as an opportunity to sort of say that the way we're looking at this is not so much as bilateral partnerships anymore, but rather creating whole networks and ecosystems that can jointly support social enterprises and accelerate the social enterprise sector in general. And I'll come back to that in a sec, what I mean with that. But the two key ways in which we work with social enterprises are through capacity building for social enterprises and the social enterprise sector. So really providing social enterprises access to our employees for pro bono support to help them with very specific business questions that they have. And the second route that we have increasingly focused on in the last 2 years is through social procurement. Basically saying that if we're buying goods and services from companies anyway, let's at least make sure we purchase them from companies that are inclusive, that are sustainable, and that are socially and environmentally responsible. And with that, we basically proclaimed about 2 years ago, we set out on a strategy called 5+5 by 25, where we want to purchase 5% of our addressable spend for goods and services from social enterprises and 5% from diverse suppliers. So those are sort of the two angles that we're pursuing. And we've been able, by ourselves, we've been able to drive quite a lot in these areas. But here's where I come back to sort of figuring out how we built this more into an ecosystem and into a network. Even if you're as a multinational like SAP and some of the other companies that are here today, I mean, we're pretty big. There's quite a lot that we can do by ourselves, but ultimately there's only so far you can go again. And ultimately the impact that you're achieving through bilateral relationships and partnerships are still only a drop in the ocean. And what you often see is that many other companies are doing similar work. They're partnering with the same kinds of organizations, but things aren't aligned. And because they aren't aligned, you're not really driving collective impact. And you might actually even cannibalize each other in terms of your efforts in driving social impact. So when it comes to capacity building, for example, we're now much more interested in joining forces with others and figuring out how do we make sure that social enterprises know where to turn to get access to the kind of support that they need, be it from a financial or a non-financial support perspective. One example in how that can work is, and I think somebody has already posted it, we just recently launched the Transform Support Hub in jointly with Unilever and Moving Worlds. And it's basically supposed to become a bit of a one-stop shop for social enterprises to access support from the corporate world. So that's one way, but also in social procurement, it's the same thing. You know, there's only so far that we can go with social procurement, but much more interesting is figuring out how can we, with like-minded corporates, build the right kind of, or help support the right kind of infrastructure to increase market access for social enterprises to corporate supply chains.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was, very comprehensive and some great examples there to unpackage. Now that Elsa's back, would love to hear some examples from her end on how social entrepreneurs and corporations can do more together and what she's working on currently.
Thank you. Apologies for that technical glitch. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, very well.
Great. So yeah, at IKEA Social Entrepreneurship, we work in the intersection between our philanthropy from IKEA Foundation and the business. And why did we set up this little entity to support social entrepreneurs, both financially and non-financially? Well, there are many whys. First of all, the vision of IKEA is a better everyday life for the many people. And we know that the world is changing. We have common challenges where corporates need to play a big role in climate. We have the growing inequalities and unrest in the world. And we see that partnerships for the future is the only way we can go to co-create a better future for everyone. So for us, partnering with social enterprises and social entrepreneurs has many dimensions. Of course, there is the supply dimension, but for us, actually, it's both products and services, but even more, it's about social innovation. And how can we learn from social entrepreneurs? How can we co-create new solutions to work with these challenging setups? For instance, for smallholders that are part of global value chains, for informal workers, that the more we are going to work with recycled material, the more we are going to see informal sections coming in to our core business. So we see that us investing in both the movement as such, in different social entrepreneurs, as well as systemic approaches, we can contribute to more transformative ways to improve people's livelihoods. So there are very many aspects why we do this.
Thank you, Elsa. So based on everything I've heard so far, it sounds like, there's a lot of activity in the space. Corporations are really doubling down on commitments to social enterprises and working hand in hand with social entrepreneurs in some way, working with competitors in some way to really drive the space. So there seems to be a lot of activity, yet at the same rate, as an outsider, sometimes it seems like there's not enough. I heard from Alexandra that we need greater alignment across the ecosystem around the sort of causes and objectives. Sometimes there's duplicative efforts taking place. We need to learn better from one another. We also need to create avenues to truly access those on the ground, especially in harder to reach communities. So given all of these complications, would love to just switch over to Sumitra and just hear from your perspective and your work with Ashoka, what do you think are the main barriers to these social entrepreneurs and enterprises really accessing all of this corporate activity and all of the corporate resources that exist?
Yeah, sure, Samira. I think the first step is to see the opportunity as something bigger than just an enterprise transaction. I think one of the biggest barriers right now across corporations is this very heavy focus on profit over purpose. So while you're trying to do profit and purpose, I think, the Friedman doctrine is really very strong in many entities that and if you remember the quote, he argued that a company has no social responsibility to the public or society. Its only responsibility is to its shareholders. And that's quite entrenched, I think, in a lot of leadership's mentality, particularly in businesses around where we are. So the key question there, I think, then is how do we manage this tension and dilemma with profit versus purpose? I think it's a big question. And that requires very, very astute leadership in the organization, top down. So I think that's one barrier, I think, to seeing mass adoption and across the board. The second thing is, I love what Natalia was saying, and Asar and Yasmina, like a lot of solutions, we can do the quick fix. What we really love to invite corporations to really think about is systemic solutions, things that go really deep down to the root causes of the problem. And particularly in the Global South, a lot of these issues are intersectional. They're not just about hungry children. They're about nutrition, linked with education, linked with poverty, linked with multiple factors. So we'll need to adopt and develop really a lot more capacity for empathy, right? So we talked about leadership, but the second thing is deep empathy, and really look at investing into solutions that are systemic, but also that are changing the narrative. As Natalia says, we do need a shift in narrative. So this sort of empathy building, new leadership, I think these are some of the things that I would like to see more of in order to unlock greater collaboration.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And then speaking of narrative, Natalia, you introduced us to your work earlier, but how are you planning to carry your work forward in truly getting into corporations, accessing leadership, and trying to shift their mindset so that they are rewriting their narratives and are more focused on purpose over profit? How does, like what Sumitra said, relate to your work going forward?
So currently, we are very focused on developing an initiative called the New Zero World. So this has been a few quite years in the making. We incubated this when I was at the UN Global Compact. So now we're working with the UNFCCC on this initiative and with the UN Energy, the Sustainable Energy for All, with the goal of shifting the narrative from climate change to the everything change. So we really talk about the different aspect of how climate, affects and for businesses, for people. And when I say the everything change, you can a little bit see the Sustainable Development Goals in between the everything change, like everything we eat is going to change. It is changing. The clothing we wear, we're more focused on being sustainable. The cars we drive are electric. So our ecosystem is changing, and meaning businesses are changing, meaning social entrepreneurs take a huge role. So I think what we decided to kind of like move in the direction of 4 pillars that can activate that, and I can create more mainstreaming engagement, and have an opportunity for businesses to also align and connect directly. For example, the 4 pillars of this initiative speaks about to create a people's house, a very inclusive place where people will convene, understand, learn, get educated, but also have opportunities to showcase, impact solutions. One of the things we also learn, and I have been learning in the past years, is that sometimes the climate conversation or the environmental or the social impact conversation, it turns very elitist. It is a reality, and like the information, it's not really quite easy accessible for everybody. So we decided that one of the pillars of this initiative should be to have a people's house in which we can have the engagement, more open space for this. Actually, we focus on, for example, indigenous communities, the youth, social entrepreneurs, because that is the force, the huge force we want to attack. Those are the ones, in reality, like when we talk about citizenship, people taking a stand. So people are really making us move faster. So public opinion and this changing narrative are going to force governments, are going to force businesses, are going to make a quick mobilization into action. And that is why we decided to go with that strategy. There are other components on this initiative, but I think that is one of them in which we, bring this merge between corporate and people, the same way as we have, other instances in this initiative that we want to educate more, like industries that speak about narrative, for example, how we can accelerate and move in one direction with entertainment industries, with advertising and marketing industries and products, and media as well. So just a few examples, but happy to explain more anytime.
Yeah, excellent examples, Natalia. And it was good hearing about how we need to ground ourselves in sort of medium to long-term thinking, systems change, as Sumitra mentioned, this notion of really business model shift and rewriting narratives over the medium to long term. With that said, I want to shift gears a little bit because I know there have been, a lot of wins in the recent past in a short number of years. And Yasmina, I know you work very closely with social entrepreneurs and social enterprises that are actually, facing success and working with corporations. So more pragmatically, just tangibly, would love to hear some of the stories from on the ground that you've seen and kind of build off of some of that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that there does need to be a kind of systemic lens on this. And in fact, often where we've seen a lot of progress, it's because there are policies in place or major commitments made by an industry or a corporation that drive kind of behavior change on the corporate side and on the kind of mainstream business side. And I think policies can do a lot to enable more of this kind of work. But I guess when I look at this through the lens of social enterprises, and certainly the ones in our community, because they are in the process of building their business, they don't always have the luxury of being able to kind of focus on systems change and policy change. They are really trying to get their business going. So when we looked at the ones that have been most successful, there were a few kind of success factors that stood out. One is just being very clear on the value that you are bringing to the marketplace. So there's a company that we work with in India called Promethean Power, and their mission was to bring electricity to rural communities in India. But what they saw as a real market opportunity was to focus on cold chain for dairy farmers, where they could actually see an immediate improvement in livelihoods for rural communities that were heavily dependent on the dairy industry, and at the same time started working closely with the dairy industry kind of at the commercial scale to see what would be able to add the most value, and essentially built a business model around that need for higher quality fresh dairy from more remote rural villages. And it's an intervention that has enabled them to reach many, many farmers, not only improving incomes for farmers, but really making the whole dairy industry much more inclusive. So I think a lot of takeaways there. One was that the larger dairy business that they were working with was willing to be really flexible with them in payment terms and make it possible for them to invest in building out that market by paying them upfront in exchange for discounts. So again, nobody was acting out of pure altruism, but thinking really strategically about how to make markets work and create more value. And sadly, I think their corporate client is not that focused on improving livelihoods for smallholder farmers, but what they're getting from this is higher quality, more reliable dairy supply. And I think that's something that we have to recognize, that while we want there to be an ethical transformation, and we see some of that happening, there's many entrepreneurs that are working with companies because they're able to deliver higher value, better quality, more diversified, reliable supply chain, which counts for a lot right now. So when I think about how to support enterprises, I think it's really giving them the tools to build those business models, to understand product market fit, to be able to invest in product innovation, and deliver that value rather than just focusing on behavior change on the part of corporates, which again is super important, but we're looking at the entrepreneurs. access to capital remains another key need. And so it's thinking about, how do you provide the capital that enterprises need in order to grow at that level, whether it's equity, debt for working capital, and really thinking about kind of how to tailor the ways that we support enterprises as they look to serve those markets, rather than kind of generic, grants or kind of certain kinds of funding that can be more difficult for entrepreneurs to work with as they're trying to grow their business. Like expensive debt is a good example. So yeah, I think that, those are some of the basic things that we've seen for entrepreneurs that have made this work, often just dealing with the realities. And I guess the third I would say is networks. A lot of enterprises remain kind of largely invisible to markets, and our ability in the intermediary space is to create that visibility. So we were able to create a list that is now posted and hosted on the World Economic Forum site of 100 corporate-ready enterprises. These are all companies that are already selling to corporations across industries, across geographies. I'll add the link. But anything we can do to raise visibility of actual companies that are ready to do business, I think can help to break down perceptions and hopefully actually create some new relationships. So I guess it speaks to that ecosystem, but getting really practical about networks that close that gap of visibility for entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Yasmina. I absolutely love that perspective of actually empowering these social enterprises so that they're able to, not just bring new innovations, but add value to the core business and also influence the way in which the corporation thinks. So that was a really powerful example. Would love to hear some more examples from Alexandra and Ausa as well. So Ausa, I would love to hear an example from you, just similar to Yasmina shared, of a success story where you've really worked with a social enterprise and experienced that value at IKEA.
Yeah, I can name a couple. We do have direct supply relationships with social enterprises, for instance, in India, working with the women in the rural areas that have little or no education, and in Jordan, for instance, working with women refugees from the Syria war, combined with local women from the Jordan communities that are living in difficult circumstances. And for us, of course, they add a lot of value thanks to that they're making beautiful handicraft products that we have co-designed to fit what our consumers like. So it adds a beautiful range and also stories about the women that you can take with you into your home. So that is one part that we work with. But I think for us, the more interesting part is where we can contribute to more holistic transitions. So for instance, we had one social enterprise called Ignitia that have invented an algorithm to predict weather in tropical areas, which didn't exist before. That was really trustworthy, that you could also get access to as a smallholder, and they distribute this information via text messages to the smallholders, so they know when to sow, harvest, and fertilize, and so forth. And by doing that, they can also increase their yield and their income. And so corporates are often set up in sectors. So for instance, the purchasing of cocoa or the purchasing of any other agricultural is set up like this. But when you look at how smallholders are organized, they work with multiple crops. They have maybe even other types of income. So you need to address the challenge more in that way. We also have another interesting example in Brazil. Vivenda, who was part of one of our accelerators, who wanted to improve the housing of the people living in the favelas, but recognized that he could only do so much by growing organically. So he instead created a platform to make it possible for all the initiatives that support, work with, fund, to contribute to improving the living conditions in the favelas. And hence he can grow exponentially by connecting all the stakeholders in the ecosystem. So in that case, this social entrepreneur is more a facilitator of a systems change. And we believe that there is a lot of power into that, into using that change agent force to co-create a better future.
I love the use of change agent force. I haven't heard that before, but networks are so very important to this space, as well as sort of making those linkages and platforms to support the entrepreneurs and businesses alike together. So on that point, Alexandra, if you could share an example from your experience, and also maybe just elaborate on what Elsa said with regards to the importance of networks and making those connections, given what you've seen.
Yeah. Before I give an example, I would love to sort of just comment on what Sumitra and Yasmina were also talking about earlier with regards to systemic change, right? Because it sort of piqued me a little bit, where I thought, okay, I would love to bring sort of an additional perspective to this because sometimes when you talk this way with corporates, and especially with executives in corporates that are not involved in this kind of work day in, day out, like us, who are almost a bit in a bubble, their eyes glaze over when you start talking to them about systemic change, right? It just becomes very abstract to them, and then makes it hard for them to relate to it, and it might actually make it really hard for them to buy into whatever you're trying to do, right? So my key learning, honestly, in the last 12 years of working in this space has been, yes, always keep the lens of wanting to drive systemic change and having big, bold dreams and visions, but start really pragmatic and small, and make the impact that you're generating from a social perspective, but also the impact, the value that you're driving for the business, really tangible. Because if you don't do that, you lose people on the way. And I feel very passionately about this, because I've seen it happen before, where we've come with, these big, bold ideas, and we would try to sell it. And the moment that I would start talking about systemic change, it was like, woof, people would go like, oh, okay, let's talk about something else. So just wanted to bring that perspective in as well, that, that doesn't mean that you need to lose sort of sight of that, but it's okay to start small, tangible, and very pragmatic. I think sort of some of the examples, maybe also more for corporates that are on this call, maybe more also from a business value perspective. I think what doesn't get talked enough about is the value that capacity building or pro bono consulting, pro bono volunteering can bring to the business. It's not just about volunteering and giving back. Actually, these kinds of programs, providing non-financial support to social enterprises through pro bono volunteering, is probably one of the most unique experiential leadership development opportunities that anybody in a corporate can go through. And this is something that we have seen very, very concretely with our programs. We have seen that through participation in projects with social enterprises, employees feel better equipped to lead global teams. They feel better equipped to find solutions for customers, simple solutions for customers. They have better customer orientation. And last, but definitely not least, they get very tangible experiences of what driving social and environmental impact actually means. So when a company talks abstractly about sustainability, here's now suddenly a whole range of employees that have a very hands-on experience of what sustainability is. And that is a massive value that I think gets underestimated a little bit. We have also, very honestly, we have worked 10 years trying to embed pro bono volunteering as part of an employee's learning journey at SAP. In the last year, we finally succeeded. So it's really become completely integrated now, but it's a long journey to get there. But if you're able to do that, that's where you are able to get closer to the business and integrate into the core business. So just wanted to bring those aspects to the table because I think it's sort of something that we haven't touched upon in this conversation yet.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because I think a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with can be very skeptical of programs that deliver non-financial value, whether it's a pro bono employee engagement program or an accelerator. Their question is always like, show me the money, which I completely understand. But I think they often overlook that opportunity to engage more deeply, to understand who are their corporate counterparts, who are the people there, how do they start to bridge that gap, and honestly take away that opportunity to build their own capabilities, learning the languages, the tools that are used in the corporate setting. And so many of the companies that ended up on our list had started out with a capacity building program, an accelerator, an employee engagement program, and it opened the door for them to facilitate a longer term relationship that was more commercial, but that wasn't the starting point.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I think that's sort of a good segue into some of the questions that we have coming in. We only have, 12 minutes left. So did want to turn to the questions. Megan has here, she's asking about the relevance of the SDGs for corporations and whether or not they have been effectively integrated into corporate reporting. And I think the SDGs are quite important just as a way to ground the conversation. And now we've kind of shifted away from that. So would love just rapid fire responses from each of the speakers on the relevance of the SDGs, or not necessarily each of the speakers, but whoever wants to take that. Sumitra, I see you're unmuted, so over to you.
I think the SDGs are a wonderful forcing mechanism to get corporations focused. I think to Alexandra's point, you do get the glazing over and you do get the myopia. So I think it's been a wonderful way to kind of say, this is what we're focused on and these are the shifts we're going to create. Whether it's enough, the best estimations are we're going to reach those goals in 2097. So I'd love to figure out how to shift the narrative, to do the quick fixes, but also do the long, and go for the long game.
Yeah, and I'll add just, I think what I'm hearing more than SDG when we talk to corporate leaders is ESG, and concrete goals built around those. In an ideal world, they have concrete goals that they're measuring against. So I think understanding what are the key ESG metrics, things like carbon mitigation, I think is definitely on the list. And then supplier diversity, like every company we talked to that was even starting to think about this started with supplier diversity. So looking at how do you highlight what you bring as a supplier from a diversity lens, I think is a really strong selling point at from where people are now. I think that can evolve and go much deeper. Women's economic empowerment, youth employment, those are the frames that I'm seeing. And so being able to measure and talk about how you're delivering that. I don't necessarily hear people say like, we're tackling all the SDGs. They may be tackling one. And so it's often understanding what's the language that your counterpart is speaking and how do you communicate at that level rather than kind of try to move them over to something that is not a priority.
And going back to sort of the terminology, we have another question around whether or not corporations are including sort of dialogues like stakeholder capitalism and economics of mutuality when they talk about their work with social entrepreneurs. So that's the gist of the question. And Alexandra, I'd love for you to take that one because you did speak about, how we should use sort of appropriate or optimal language when engaging executives. So how are you seeing stakeholder capitalism and economics of mutuality play out at SAP, if at all?
I think at a high level, it definitely plays out and there is conversation around it. But again, it's about making it concrete and tangible, right? And I think what I think we all have to be a bit careful about is that that these kinds of conversations within corporates don't happen between always the same people, right? Because that's sort of what happens, right? You have sort of a few organizational units that are working on these kinds of issues and they drive it, but then they create this bubble within a corporate and it doesn't become mainstream. So I think we're trying to anchor that by being very clear that we're driving a holistic sustainability strategy, and that sustainability strategy finds its roots in stakeholder capitalism. But we rarely talk about it itself in a broader audience within the company. I have to admit. Not sure if that's the right or the wrong thing. I do think that sort of bringing that conversation to more people would be better. But I think you would have to be really careful in how you do it. But what has definitely become mainstream is the conversation around sustainability, particularly if you look at it from a holistic perspective. And in that, I also agree with Yasmina that the SDGs are, in the first few years, they were talked about a lot, but mainly from a framework and language and narrative perspective. And now it's still used as an orientation, but definitely not as a measurement, right? Sort of focusing impact measurement around it. That's really more centered around ESG. Yeah, I don't think that was a very deep answer on that, but
I want to add something. I want to take the opportunity to add something I put in the chat, some resources about the SDG Ambition Program, for example, and there's an accelerator that created for SMEs. So if you want to just feel free to get information from the UN Global Compact, and it provides a framework for entrepreneurship on how to actually integrate the SDGs, more focus on SMEs.
And just to build on that very, very quickly, I know we're running out of time. There's this brilliant, I feel a strong calling. I'm deeply grateful for Alexandra grounding us into the reality of what's happening in our markets. And I think as we close up, I think that, Ulrika here talks about the inner development goals. I follow that quite closely as well. This really needs to start at the top. And that's the challenge. I think in the conversation is we really need to see the world in a much more mutualistic, through a more mutualistic lens. And there are examples out there. And how do we get that in? And part of that is a new conscious leadership, a new way of organizing and leading organizations into that. You need a lot of strength, a lot of courage, because the market forces are entirely against you. But Jacqueline Novogratz also talks about this, new moral leadership, and I my sense is the world is actually calling for that. And winners and losers in terms of companies, I can think about the Forbes 50 and the Forbes 100. But sensing where young people are at right now, and sensing where young employees are in companies, that shift towards a stronger moral compass and a more mutual equation is going to happen sooner than we think. I'm feeling optimistic, particularly when we have organizations like IKEA who are also paving the way and structuring very differently to allow for different shareholder and stakeholder needs. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there.
Mitra, thanks for that. That's, a really amazing way to close the session. So with, I would love comments, closing remarks from other speakers as well. Just any thoughts you have that you want to leave the audience with, etc. Yasmina, would love to hear from you. Any closing remarks. I really love the focus on individuals and sort of the younger employees and that energy. So over to you.
Yeah, no, I think in some ways all of us are here because we are optimistic and we believe that we can create change despite any evidence to the contrary and all the massive problems that we're looking at. I do want to just echo again sort of what Alex was saying about taking a pragmatic approach, because I think in some ways the real concrete impact can add up while we continue to have conversations about systems change, and really looking for those alliances and partnerships and resources that can help people advance their work on the ground. It comes back to sort of the people that we're all looking to impact and support, but putting them first and saying, there's so much that we can discuss and explore and define. But at the end of the day, I think if we demonstrate impact and sustainability and the transformation that's possible, we can achieve more. So encourage people to make it concrete, get something going on the ground, find a starting point as much as possible. And, I think a lot of great resources have been shared to help make that happen.
Yeah, excellent. Alexandra, over to you for closing remarks.
I think you probably noticed that we actually work quite closely with each other, right? Because Yasmina has actually said everything that I wanted to say too. Just picking maybe up on sort of the partnership and alliance perspective, and that is just something that has inspired and motivated me so much in the last 2 years, because not only have we in the last few years been able to partner and collaborate in actually much in different ways than we did before, like moving from these bilateral partnerships to more sort of ecosystems and network kind of partnerships and alliances. But I've also seen that others are doing it too. So, organizations that maybe in the past didn't think about partnering with each other are now finding ways of collaborating and driving collective impact. And I think for this space, for the social enterprise sector, that is so needed and helpful to make sure that, sort of everybody is working in the same direction and is moving the puzzle pieces, put pieces along. And I think that is just something that that I find hugely inspiring, and why I'm also very optimistic about the future. And otherwise, I can't say more than Yasmina said as well. Just start somewhere, like just get going and start having conversations, and don't always think about the barriers, right? But think about the opportunities, and find like-minded people that build you up in the background and keep you going when you feel like things are not happening.
Excellent. Start somewhere. So Elsa, over to you for your closing remarks.
Thanks. Yeah, I echo Alexandra. We work really closely together, and we got to know each other during the pandemic when we were doing this very close collaboration to see how can this movement strengthen also the corporate movement. And I would say, Sumitra, you were rightly saying there needs to be top level commitment, but there also need to be a movement from the ground, because business is people, people is business. You need to be a change agent also internally in the corporate. So we talk about social intrapreneurship, that is so important to drive the movements and the change aspects. And I think for us, also talking specifically about social entrepreneurship, we engage our co-workers as coaches and experts and the networkers and door openers for the social entrepreneurs. And in many programs, we intentionally have young talent together with a little bit senior IKEA leaders working together with one social entrepreneur, transferring knowledge and also creating new types of mindsets and new types of leaderships for the future. And we see that that is a very powerful way to get perspective on what you're doing day to day, and combining that with supporting the inner development, goals development that we are doing. We believe this can create pathways for the future, because those are big machineries that needs to be not tweaked, but totally reinvented. So how can we work with innovation for a green planet and innovation for an equal and fair people, society approach?
Very powerful, Elsa. Over to you, Natalia, for closing remarks.
Thank you, Samira. Well, it's been such a pleasure to be with everybody discussing this. Just a very just very close remarks in terms of I think the space is blurring in terms of mainstream. I think all of this is evolving, more. The social entrepreneurship is such a force, again, like I mentioned before. But I think I would like to take the optic of being optimistic. I think there is a lot of social impact work out in the world. I think the corporates are also taking that into account, and the work it's just really becoming so important. I believe it is it is becoming mainstream. And I think there is a lot of opportunities for social entrepreneurs, for partnerships and engagement with a lot of initiatives out there. So thank you so much.
Thanks. And I know we're at time. Sumitra, do you want to bring us full circle and then we can thank everyone and close the session out?
Sure, Samira. Thank you, everyone. I think everyone said mostly a lot of things that I feel strongly about. I think what I'd like to underscore is the opportunity to really shift culture in companies by just bringing social entrepreneurs much closer, social entrepreneurs and social enterprises, big or small, short-term or long-term, into that ecosystem and drive more exchanges in order to create and unlock. That's exactly the word, the entrepreneurship within corporations. And my big bet is on young people in the organization. And, how can we get them central to the conversation? Because I think they can unlock a lot in companies. So thank you, Samira, and thank you everyone for having us.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for joining, and special thanks to the speakers. We'll share the recording later. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye, everyone.